Hello, everyone. Trump just threatened to bomb Canadian oil pipelines. Not sanction them, not tariff them, bomb them. And if you think that sentence sounds like something from a political thriller novel, you need to stop what you are doing right now. Because what is unfolding between the United States and Canada is no longer a trade dispute. It is the opening chapter of an energy war between two countries that were supposed to be the closest allies on Earth. The world you woke up in this morning is gone. The assumptions that held this continent together, the unspoken agreements, the handshakes across the border, the decades of mutual dependence dressed up in the language of friendship, all of it is being dismantled in real time, pipeline by pipeline, threat by threat, by one man sitting in the Oval Office who has decided that Canada is not an ally. Canada is a target. You need to understand what this moment actually is, because the mainstream media will spend the next 48 hours debating tone and diplomatic language and whether the president really meant what he said. They will soften it, they will contextualize it into irrelevance, they will interview retired ambassadors who will shake their heads and say, this is unprecedented and deeply concerning, and then the segment will end, and they will move on to the weather. But you cannot move on from this because what Donald Trump just did is not a gaffe. It is not an exaggeration. It is a declaration of intent from the most powerful man on earth directed at a country of 40 million people who have done nothing but exist next door to him. And the energy crisis that his words have already set in motion will not stop at the Canadian border. It is coming south into your gas tank, your heating bill, your grocery receipt, and your retirement account. This is your story too. To understand the full weight of what just happened, you have to go back, not years, decades. You have to go back to a time when North America operated on a single unspoken assumption, so fundamental, so deeply embedded in the architecture of this continent that no politician in Washington or Ottawa ever thought they needed to write it down. The assumption was simple. The United States and Canada do not threaten each other. They trade, they negotiate, they disagree, sometimes loudly, sometimes bitterly, over lumber and dairy and softwood and fish, but they do not threaten each other's infrastructure. They do not aim weapons, real or rhetorical, at the pipelines and refineries and energy systems that keep 40 million Canadians warm in winter and keep American factories running year-round. That rule was not in any treaty. It did not need to be. It was the bedrock of North American civilization, and it had held for over 150 years. The energy relationship between the United States and Canada is not merely close. It is the single largest energy trading relationship on the planet. Canada is the #1 source of foreign oil for the United States, supplying roughly 4 million barrels per day, more than Saudi Arabia, more than any OPEC nation, more than any country on earth. The pipelines that carry that oil, and Bridge Line 5, the Trans Mountain System, the Keystone Network, are not just infrastructure. They are arteries. They are the cardiovascular system of North American energy. And every refinery in the American Midwest, every gas station in Minnesota and Michigan and Illinois, every heating system that keeps American families alive through February depends on them functioning without interruption. Donald Trump just threatened to interrupt them permanently. Now, let us talk about the man himself, because you cannot understand this threat without understanding the psychology and the politics behind the person making it. Donald Trump did not arrive at this moment by accident. He has been escalating his posture toward Canada for months, treating the northern border not as a boundary between allies, but as a front line in a war he has decided to fight. It started with tariffs. In early 2025, Trump imposed sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods. 25% on most imports, 10% on energy, framing Canada not as a trading partner, but as an economic adversary that had been exploiting American generosity for decades. He called Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's government weak. He suggested repeatedly and in public that Canada should simply become the 51st state of the United States, as if 40 million people with their own history, their own identity, and their own sovereignty were merely an administrative inconvenience waiting to be absorbed. But the tariffs were not enough. The rhetoric crossed a line that no American president has ever crossed before. Reports emerged that Trump, in conversations with advisors and in statements that sent shockwaves through diplomatic channels in Ottawa, Washington, and Brussels, suggested that Canadian oil pipelines could be targets, that the infrastructure keeping Canada's energy economy alive could be destroyed as a tool of geopolitical leverage. Whether those words came directly from the president's mouth or from the orbit around him, the message that landed in Ottawa was identical. The most powerful military force in human history was being pointed, however rhetorically, at Canadian soil. Mark Carney is not a man who rattles easily. He is a former governor of the Bank of Canada. He steered the Bank of England through Brexit. He has sat across the table from the most powerful financial institutions on earth and held his position. But when the threat of physical destruction of Canadian infrastructure entered the conversation, even Carney's controlled technocratic exterior cracked. Canadian officials responded with alarm. Statements were issued, emergency briefings were called, and the word that kept surfacing in Ottawa's corridors was one that no Canadian government official ever expected to use in reference to the United States: hostile. Let us now walk through exactly what happened step by step, because the details matter enormously, and the details are what mainstream coverage keeps glossing over in its rush to reassure you that everything is fine. Everything is not fine. The escalation began in the early months of 2025, when the Trump administration reintroduced and expanded tariffs on Canadian goods, including a specific and devastating 10% tariff on Canadian energy exports. Canada sends approximately $140 billion worth of energy to the United States every year. A 10% tariff on that volume is not a negotiating chip. It is a financial assault. Canadian energy producers, the companies operating in the Alberta oil sands, the pipeline operators, and the refineries in Ontario immediately began absorbing losses while simultaneously trying to calculate how long they could sustain operations under that kind of pressure. Canada's response under Carney's direction was not to capitulate. It was to pivot. Canada announced retaliatory tariffs on American goods totaling over $100 billion. It accelerated conversations with the European Union about alternative trade partnerships. It began fast-tracking the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion to increase export capacity to Asian markets, explicitly reducing dependence on the American buyer. Carney stood in front of cameras and said with deliberate calm that the old relationship with the United States was over and that Canada needed to chart a new course. That pivot, that act of economic self-determination, enraged Washington, because here is what Donald Trump cannot tolerate. He cannot tolerate a smaller nation choosing independence over submission. Every time Canada made a move toward economic sovereignty, every pipeline rerouted toward Asia, every trade deal signed with Europe, every statement from Carney that Canada would not be bullied, Trump escalated, the tariffs went up, the rhetoric got sharper, the threats got more specific, and then came the pipeline threat, which arrived not as a formal policy statement, but as something far more dangerous. A signal floated through conversations and reports and the deliberately vague language of an administration that understands the power of ambiguity as a weapon. The signal was received loudly. Now follow the money, because this is where the story stops being about politics and starts being about your life. The pipelines Trump threatened to destroy carry approximately 4 million barrels of Canadian crude oil into the United States every single day. The Enbridge Line 5, which runs through Michigan beneath the Straits of Machine, alone carries 500,000 barrels per day and supplies roughly 55% of the oil needs for the state of Michigan, along with large portions of Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Ontario. If that pipeline stops operating, whether through political pressure, legal action, or the kind of physical threat now being floated in Washington, the refineries it feeds go dark. When refineries go dark, gasoline supply drops. When gasoline supply drops, prices rise, not by pennies, by dollars, by the kind of numbers that change how you budget for groceries, and that determine whether a small business dependent on transportation survives the quarter. The heating oil picture is even more immediate. Canada supplies critical energy inputs for the northeastern United States during winter months. New England, which already operates on some of the tightest energy margins in the country during peak winter demand, would face shortages of a severity not seen since the energy crisis of the 1970s if Canadian pipeline infrastructure were disrupted. The economists who have modeled this scenario do not use the word inconvenient. They use the word catastrophic. They use phrases like cascading supply failure and multi-year recovery timeline. These are not alarmist projections from opposition think tanks. These are the internal assessments of energy analysts who have spent their careers studying exactly this kind of disruption and never expected to have to dust off their worst-case models for a threat coming from inside the continent. For Canada, the consequences are even more immediate and more personal. 40% of Canada's entire GDP is connected directly or indirectly to its energy sector. The oil sands of Alberta represent one of the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. Over 170 billion barrels of recoverable oil. The pipelines that carry that oil to market are not just an industry. They are the financial spine of the Canadian economy. Threatening them is not a negotiating tactic. It is an existential provocation. It is the equivalent of telling a country that the thing keeping it economically alive might be destroyed, and then watching what happens to its currency, its bond markets, its business confidence, and its people. The Canadian dollar began sliding the moment the threat entered public consciousness. Businesses in Alberta and Ontario began making contingency calculations they never imagined would be necessary. Insurance markets for pipeline infrastructure, already tightening under years of environmental litigation, began receiving inquiries that their actuaries had no historical model for pricing. How do you insure a pipeline against a threat from the President of the United States? Here is the deeper truth that no one in the mainstream coverage wants to say out loud. What Donald Trump is doing to Canada is not a trade dispute that got out of hand. It is a deliberate, calculated campaign to destabilize a sovereign nation's economy until that nation's government either collapses or capitulates. The tariffs are not about protecting American workers. The pipeline threats are not about American energy security. They are about power. They are about establishing permanently and unmistakably that the United States under Trump operates not as a partner within a rules-based international order, but as an imperial power that uses economic and military leverage to bring smaller nations to heel. Starting with the ones closest to home, starting with the one that shares the longest undefended border in world history, starting with the ally that trusted America the most and therefore left itself the most exposed. This is what imperialism looks like when it wears a suit and holds a press conference. It does not arrive with soldiers on the border. It arrives with tariffs and threats and the slow, methodical dismantling of the economic infrastructure that keeps a nation independent. It arrives with a president who calls your prime minister weak, suggests your country should be absorbed into his, and then floats the idea of bombing your pipelines when you refuse to comply. The countries of the global south have seen this playbook before. They know what it looks like when a great power decides that a smaller nation's sovereignty is negotiable. Canada is now living that experience, and the fact that Canada is a wealthy, democratic NATO member nation with a sophisticated economy and a seat at the G7 table has provided precisely zero protection. That should terrify every American who still believes the United States stands for something beyond the exercise of raw power. Because if the rules do not apply to Canada, they do not apply to anyone. And if they do not apply to anyone, there are no rules. There is only force. And a world governed only by force is a world where the United States is not the leader, it is the threat. Now let us talk about what comes next. Because the trajectory of this conflict does not bend gently, it accelerates. In the next 30 days, if the Trump administration does not walk back the pipeline threat with the kind of formal, unambiguous language that Ottawa is demanding, Canada will face a decision point as consequential as any it has faced in its modern history. Mark Carney's government will have to choose publicly and permanently between two paths. The first path is accommodation, some version of concession to Washington's demands, whether on tariffs, trade balances, or energy pricing, that allows both sides to claim a partial victory and step back from the ledge. The second path is confrontation. Canada doubles down on its economic pivot, accelerates its partnerships with Europe and Asia, challenges the pipeline threats through international legal mechanisms, and invites the world to witness what American pressure looks like when applied to its closest neighbor. Carney has already signaled through his words and his actions that he intends to walk the second path. He has spoken about Canada's need for a new economic identity. He has fast-tracked diversification strategies. He has stood before the Canadian people and told them without flinching that the era of assuming American goodwill is finished. That is not the language of a man preparing to capitulate. That is not the language of a man preparing to capitulate. That is the language of a leader building a bunker and daring his opponent to test its walls. And this is where the calculation gets cold for both sides. Carney knows something that Trump's team either ignores or refuses to accept. Canada holds leverage that cannot be measured in barrels or dollars alone. It holds geography. It holds the Arctic. It holds the Northwest Passage. It holds the strategic depth that every American war plan for the last 80 years has quietly assumed would be available as safe harbor, as staging ground, as Allied territory that would never be contested. Those assumptions are now in doubt, not because Canada would ever join a coalition against the United States, but because trust, once broken, does not repair itself on a timeline convenient for generals. Every Pentagon war game, every NORAD protocol, every Continental defense strategy written since 1958 has been built on a single axiom. The northern flank is secure. Canada is not a vulnerability. Canada is a partner. That axiom just died. It died in a conference room where someone floated the idea of bombing pipelines. It died in the silence that followed when no one in the White House immediately, forcefully, and publicly rejected it. And it died in Ottawa, where Canadian defense planners are now doing something they never imagined they would do. They are modeling the United States as a potential threat vector, not an ally, a variable, a risk factor to be planned for, hedged against, and where possible, deterred. Think about what that means for the next generation of continental defense. Every new radar installation in the Canadian Arctic, every icebreaker Canada commissions, every surveillance drone purchased from Europe instead of American contractors, every military exercise conducted without U.S. participation is a small brick in a wall being built between two countries that were supposed to be inseparable. Trump did not build that wall alone, but he laid the first stone. And Carney, brick by brick, is finishing the job. The tragedy is that neither man will feel the consequences first. The people who will feel them are the ones who live along the border, the ones whose families straddle both countries, the ones who work in factories that depend on parts crossing back and forth, the ones who heat their homes with energy that flows through pipelines. Neither government seems willing to protect anymore. They are the ones who will pay for this. They always are. So where do we go from here? 3 scenarios are now in play. The first, de-escalation, requires someone in Washington to recognize that the pipeline threat crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed without formal repudiation. That would take a level of discipline and strategic clarity this administration has never shown. The second frozen conflict is where we are heading now. Threats and counter-threats, tariffs and retaliation, a slow grinding economic war that bleeds both countries while neither admits defeat. The third, escalation, is too dark to dwell on, but too real to ignore. When great powers threaten infrastructure, accidents happen, miscalculations happen, and once physical assets start burning, no one controls where the fire stops. Carney is preparing for all 3. Trump, as far as anyone can tell, is preparing for a rally, and the rest of us are left holding the receipts.